Let's get our scene ready for the animation. The scene is 03 begin, and currently we're looking through our shot camera, but we want to leave this camera untouched and instead work through, let's say, our user camera. But we still want a way to keep track of what's happening in the shot camera because that's what counts, that's what we'd render from. So here's what we can do. Say if we're working with our 4-panel layout here, we can make sure that the top right viewport is set to our shot camera. And then we can right click right where we would switch our viewport. Let's go ahead and right click here and choose expand vertical. Great, so once that's filled in, then we can move to the opposite half and switch this to our user camera. And again, right click at the top right of our viewport and choose expand vertical. All right, so now we have a very convenient way to pose our character while keeping track of the camera that counts. All right, let's go ahead and move to our preferences. So that's going to be File, Preferences. We'll take a look at Animation. Let's go ahead and right-click and choose Restore Default. From there, we're going to switch our Add Key mode to Current Preference Settings, which looks at whatever settings we have here. Our interpolation type, we're going to set that to Constant so we can work with a blocky interpolation type, so we don't have the distraction we'd get with spline of controls floating all over the place. Some artists do like to block in that way, and if you're one of those artists, you most certainly can use this mode. I just find that using constant is less distracting. Alright, so everything is good here. We can now go ahead and close out of our preferences. We can move back to our playback options next. So we'll go to our playback menu. Let's go ahead and open up our option box. Now, if you had any animation in your scene and you wanted to change your frame rate, because we will be changing this to 24 frames per second, if you had any keyframes, you might find that using the second choice here in seconds, it's going to shift your timing a bit. However, if we go ahead and use this last option under the frame rate change, if we choose in frames, this will scale our function curves to compensate our frame rate change. So that's just something to keep in mind, but let's go ahead and make sure that we have this set to 24 frames per second. All right, we can now go ahead and close this out. And the next thing we want to check for is just to make sure we can always get back to our character's T-stance. Sometimes, as animators, that's required of us to go ahead and lock down this neutral pose, just in case there were any simulations that needed to be done. Perhaps the character has some type of cloth object attached to him, and at that point, we'd want to make sure that we save this neutral pose several frames before our first frame, which tends to be -150, -100, around that range. But since we don't have any simulations here in the scene, we could always make sure that this neutral pose is saved on frame 0, just one frame before the start. So we can go to our timeline, we can go ahead and set our playback time to 0. We can move over to frame 0 here. And we do have a character key set in the scene. It's just a way of storing keyframes on all controls much faster. If you'd like to learn how to create that, feel free to take a look at Introduction to Character Rigging. But I'm going to switch the keying mode here to Key Character Key Set. And now we can go ahead and press the K key to lock down a keyframe right here on frame 0. So you can see when we go ahead and select through all of our controls, we have a keyframe added. All right, perfect. Now, the last thing we will check for is if there's any animation in this scene. So a lot of times an animatic is created just to visually see where the character needs to be at the start and end of the sequence. And it can be very rough, so you can see here the global control was moved, and sometimes that's all we need. Don't necessarily have to pose the character. But if that's the case, we just want to go in and remove those keyframes because we're now ready to move to the next step, which is actually posing the character. All right, so let's go ahead and grab the global control here. With that selected, we can go to frame 1. I'll also make sure that our start time is set to that, so we don't get back to frame 0. But on frame 1, we can now go ahead and highlight all of the channels on the global control, right-click and choose Remove Animation. All right, so that means we are good to go. We're ready to move to the next lesson and begin animating.